There are few things as pervasive throughout human history as war. Ever since Abel got no-scoped by the first rock, we as a species have been at each other's throats over gods, honour, glory, adventure, land, resources, slaves, spices, booty, the other kind of booty that we don't talk about, and most importantly, Swedish power metal songs. Being the oldest racket there is, it should come as no surprise that the motivations for going to war are manifold. Some people go to war to gain wealth, territory, and bragging rights in the Senate. Some fight to protect their people, land, and way of life from foreign invaders. Others want to trade smallpox for gold and thick Latina GFs. Many see it as a great excuse to play with their fancy mechanised death machines, and generally, war is just a great way to give your autistic grandchildren a hobby. This video, however, is not about any of those. While some conflicts are more justified than others, they'll be called Last Malvinus over my dead body, there are some wars that are either completely bizarre or just outright stupid. Rest assured there are plenty of exciting heroes on the list, but today I thought we could get a little bit silly. So here are some of the dumbest conflicts I have ever seen. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get into the video, today's sponsor is me. In December, I'm doing some comedy shows in London. On December the 12th, I'm doing a small set at the legendary Comedy Unleashed, and then I'm doing another 2 longer shows on the 15th and 16th of December with Leo Kerse and a few others. People always love these shows and always have a great time, so I'll put the links to buy tickets to those down below. Also, I don't promote my own stuff anywhere near as much as I should, so a lot of you might not know that I actually have a second channel, where I mostly cover news and world events relating to freedom of speech, government overreach, or things that I just find funny. I also post there mostly about twice a day, so there's a lot of content on there. I also have a merch store, a Patreon, a Subscribestar, and you will find the links to all of those down below. And the reason I'm shouting out the money stuff is in the future, I plan on making a few documentaries. And I don't mean me just sitting in this room talking like I usually do on the main channel. I mean actually going out and meeting people, interviewing people, filming on location, all that stuff. But that takes a lot of time and money because while I'm out there doing all of that, I'm not in here doing the work. Also, I have plans to do other stuff in the future. I'm not ready to talk about that yet, but maybe one day. So yes, go and buy tickets to my events and come and get drunk with me. And go and subscribe to my second channel. New sponsor. Show me some love. Give me a big kiss. The first conflict that we're going to talk about today is what I like to call the Roman Bum War, or the Jew Bum War. No one else actually calls it that, but I do because it is a pretty good description of what actually happened, plus it's pretty fucking funny. However, before we get there, we do need to have a little bit of a history lesson. After Pompey the Great conquered the Kingdom of Judea in the good old days of the Republic, it was made what was called a client kingdom rather than a province. A lot of areas in the east were much more civilised than the likes of Gaul, Britain and Germany, so instead of building a local government from the ground up by establishing garrisons and appointing governors, the Romans just let the king continue to be king and do whatever the hell he wanted as long as he paid his taxes. Or else. So, apart from the odd detachment of soldiers, the only Roman that these client kingdoms usually saw was the taxman. Except, as the Roman Republic gave way to the Roman Empire, Judea was turned into a province. The client kings were replaced with Roman procurators, and the entire place became a fucking massive powder keg. And while this powder keg wouldn't blow up until the outbreak of the First Jewish War, there were a lot of Romans who liked to play with matches while sitting on top of it. The Romans' hold over their conquered peoples wasn't really helped by the fact that they didn't take provincial customs very seriously. While the client kingdoms were mostly left alone as long as they paid tribute, the Romans sought to put every barbarian they could find into a skirt. Except for Egypt, because their drip was on point. The Egyptian aesthetics were so cool that they actually made an iDubbbz out of one of Rome's most celebrated generals. But I digress. And despite their insistence on Romanifying everything that moves, the Romans were surprisingly really good about religious diversity. After all, it wasn't just gayness that they took from the Greeks. All they asked in return was that you worshipped the emperor in addition to your other gods. However, being monotheists, the Jews absolutely refused to do this. This led to a very contentious relationship, pagans versus one true god. There were also many cultural differences that really pissed off the Romans and the Jews in equal measure, but the religious angle was especially hard to reconcile. Especially considering what the Torah says should be done about people who don't toe the line. But apart from the odd religious zealot faction that would cause trouble in between bouts of infighting and the occasional Roman dipshit that tried to put a statue of the emperor in Jewish temples or raise their taxes to Babel-esque levels after an even bigger dipshit let Rome burn down while fiddling his lyre with one hand and his eunuch boy with the other, the Jews weren't really kicking up too much of a fuss. Yeah, the Romans and Jews absolutely fucking hated each other and everything was about to go to absolute shit with the Great Fire of Rome, Nero's meltdown and the Year of the Four Emperors coming in quick succession, but for now, things were relatively stable. Well, about as stable as Judea could get. While they grumbled about how much they hated the Romans taking all of their money, the Jews did render unto Caesar what was Caesar's, because you've all seen Monty Python, the Romans had done a lot for them. The Jews couldn't deny that the Romans had massively upgraded their infrastructure and made the roads and sea routes safe for all of the pilgrims heading over for Passover. And while they refused to put statues in their temples, they did make the required sacrifices to the emperor, justifying it by saying that an empire like Rome could never have come into being without the help of God. So, I suppose the Jews treated the emperor kind of like how the inquisitors treat the omnissiah. They don't like him, but he does give them all of their stuff. So, who needs principles when there's profit? The Roman bum war was only mentioned very briefly and somewhat in passing by the Jewish historian Josephus as a footnote in the much larger First Jewish War, which he chronicled, both as one of the Jews that actually fought against the Romans and later as one of the generals, and later as Emperors Vespasian and Titus's most important advisors. And good fucking lord did Vespasian and Titus crush that rebellion. Despite having written our best source on what actually happened, Josephus had certainly highly embellished the story in many places. You see, the account was sort of written as both Roman and Jewish propaganda, because he kinda switched sides, but not really. Like, the guy's involvement in the Jewish war was complicated enough that it warrants an entire video in and of itself, and that video would also be about a week long. But all of that is a decade after the fact of what we're discussing today. But I just needed you to know how tense the relationship was between the Romans and the Jews, so that you can understand why something as petty as what we're about to talk about resulted in the deaths of thousands. Sometime between 48 and 52 AD, a Roman procurator, the surprisingly aptly named Ventidius Cumanus, man's name was literally cum anus, was one of the aforementioned dipshits who really enjoyed harassing the Jews. You see, while he was in charge, he wasn't very good at actually keeping order. And he was pretty much just waiting for any chance at all to make this powder keg go off. Therefore, he didn't really keep his men under a particularly tight leash when they were in Judea, which led to a number of, let's just call them, gamer moments towards the Jews. One of these being the Bum War. In Jerusalem, there was a huge gathering of pilgrims at the temple for Passover. So many that a unit of Roman auxiliaries were called in to watch over the temple's cloisters just to keep order in case anything kicked off. They were there to act more like bouncers than anything else. But from this vantage point where they could see all and all could see them, one soldier took his chance. He turned around, bent over, lifted up his skirt, and showed his arse to the Jews. He moonied the Jews. Despite the fact that Passover is supposed to start with a full moon, the Jews were not particularly happy about this, to put it mildly. And as if being mooned during one of the holiest days of the year wasn't insulting enough, according to Josephus, the Roman soldier also, and I quote, "spake such words as you might expect upon such a posture." Which means that the Roman soldier was making farting noises at the Jews. He was... the Roman soldier was mooning the Jews and making farting noises. I mean, it turns out that the Romans are such great innovators in every field that they were even the first to attempt... Let's just move on. The Jews had just borne witness to history in the making, because this was the first ever historically recorded mooning. But, as funny as this is, the Jews did not see the incident as just a good bit of crack. So many of them furiously rushed to Communus to get him to do something about his soldier making an arse of himself. Others, however, decided to act a little bit more rashly and started throwing rocks at the soldiers. Because what son of Abraham doesn't love a good stoning? Whether Communus had directly incited the mooning or he just sat back and watched as everything went down isn't really certain. But the powder keg had definitely been lit and he couldn't control the riot. So he called in reinforcements to chase the rioting Jews out of the temple. As the soldiers moved in, the angry mob of Jews immediately started panicking and the riot morphed into a stampede as they were all trying to get away from the soldiers. Josephus then reported that 20 to 30,000 people died in a massive crush at the temple exits as the pilgrims were trying to flee from the soldiers. Which is certainly an exaggerated number, but regardless, man shows arse, thousands dead is quite a fucking headline. And not only did thousands of people die, but as far as we know, the soldier who kicked it all off wasn't even disciplined for mooning the Jews. He wasn't disciplined at all for starting a series of events that led to thousands of deaths. He completely got away with it. I mean, he must have really cracked up his superiors. By the way, while we're on the subject of Rome, some of you nerds might like to know that the Third Punic War only ended 38 years ago. I mean, it came to a de facto end in 146 BC when the Romans finally vanquished their biggest rival and then spent the next century or so conquering the rest of the Mediterranean in history's biggest victory lap. However, it turned out that the Romans were so busy Carthago delenda esting that they forgot to do all of the bureaucracy to formally end the war. Cut to the mid-1980s and the Italian mayor of Rome, Ugo Viteri, and the Tunisian mayor of modern Carthage, Chedly Cleby, noticed that there was no peace treaty on the books. So, for a laugh, they decided to sign a peace treaty on the 5th of February 1985, officially ending the Third Punic War after 2,131 years. I know that little anecdote is a lot less exciting because it didn't involve an arse literally killing thousands of fucking people, but I thought it was kinda interesting. Just don't tell Cato. As much as I really like calling it the bum war, I do have to admit that it really was just a riot. I mean, still a conflict, but it was just a riot. An appetizer for our next stupid conflict. An actual war where actual armies were fielded in battle for honour, for glory, for the most coveted of prizes. It's time for the main event. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a bucket. Before being put in this display case for posterity and bragging rights, this bucket was used to draw water from a well in the middle of the Italian city of Bologna. Nothing special about it, it's just an ordinary bucket. But to understand why something as stupid as a bucket got thousands of people killed, we're going to need a bit of context. Once again, it all started with religion. In 1154, the fake Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa decided that he was God's chosen representative and therefore he should rule Italy. The Italians disagreed, saying that God's chosen representative was the Pope, not just due to the nature of the papacy, but also because the Pope had superseded Barbarossa by having crowned him in the first place. Incensed by this second delusion of grandeur having been so thoroughly owned by facts and logic, Barbarossa invaded Italy and failed. However, his retreat triggered a political deadman switch that tore Italy in half, as its city-states coalesced into two factions. The Ghibellines, who supported Barbarossa's claim, and the Guelphs, who supported the Pope. Of these two, Bologna belonged to the latter, so they had a pretty bitter rivalry with the neighbouring city-state of Modena, who were Ghibellines. Now, city-state warfare is pretty different to clashes between nations. It's a very long march between cities that are countries apart, but Modena and Bologna are only about 30 miles apart. So, due to their proximity to each other, fighting wasn't a massive logistical undertaking that resulted in large-scale engagements with armies marching for weeks. They could just ride down the road with a couple of guys and cause a bit of havoc whenever they wanted. The two city-states would burn each other's fields, capture each other's forts, do some raiding and pillaging, and generally be massive thorns in each other's sides, but on a pretty small scale. They weren't really formally at war, but they weren't really at peace either. Less of a cold war and more of a light simmer. Feuding was weird like that, but good God did it sound fun. But it also proved to be quite unsustainable. One night in 1325, a group of soldiers from the rival city-state of Modena decided to do a little trolling. They snuck into Bologna and they stole the bucket. Probably. The jury is still out on that one because the story has become so steeped in legend over the last few hundred years that a lot of the stories vary and occasionally get their wires crossed. But some sources say that the bucket was either full of loot from a previous raid of a Modenese fort by Bologna and the party reclaiming it decided to just take the bucket as well. Others say that the Modenese were doing a little bit of robbery when they were in the city and they decided to take the bucket because they needed something to carry the loot. So, it could have been the loot, it could have just been the bucket, who knows, but one thing we do know for sure is it was definitely the principal. Regardless of what happened, Bologna was absolutely outraged by this theft. Not because of what was stolen, but due to the embarrassment of having their walls infiltrated by a bitter enemy who seemed to have just fucking pranked them. This was a step too far by Modena. Yes, the two city-states had been feuding for ages and had killed and stolen a lot from each other, but something as stupid as a bucket was the last straw. Why? Well, crops can be resown, forts can be recaptured, and infrastructure can be rebuilt. But the theft of the bucket was a direct attack on Bologna's pride. This wasn't the standard, to the victor, go the spoils type of stuff. No, the Modena forces did this specifically to insult Bologna. By stealing something as stupid as a bucket, it was seen as a mockery of them. This had been done solely to humiliate them. And pride can only be restored by seeking satisfaction. So, Bologna demanded the bucket back. And Modena said no. because how else would they respond? So, Bologna decided to take the bucket back by force, and feudal states took their pride very seriously. So, good lord, did they fucking overreact. Bologna mustered a huge sausage fest of 30,000 foot soldiers and 2,000 cavalry with the support of fellow Guelphs such as Florence and Romagna. On the 15th of November, 1325, this coalition met the Modenian forces, which numbered only 5,000 foot soldiers and 2,000 cavalry, outside the town of Zappolino. Now, the Modenians were outnumbered almost 6-1, so it wasn't looking really good for them. But one of the perks of their support of the German pretender was that they were provided with quality, trained soldiers by the Larper and other Ghibelline city-states like Milan. Therefore, the Modenian army was full of professional, highly trained German mercenaries, who ended up making very, very light work of Bologna's mostly untrained and seriously disorganised militia. After just 2 hours and more than 2,000 casualties, the Battle of Zappolino ended with the Bolognese army fleeing back home as spaghetti fell out of their pockets and the Modenese army chasing after them. Even after the Bolognese, Italian history just makes me feel really hungry, were back behind their walls, they still weren't safe. The Modenese then destroyed a few castles, kidnapped some nobles, and broke the sluice lock on the Reno River that actually brought water into the city. At this point, the Modenese were ready for an outright siege of the city now that the Bolognese were without water. However, it didn't come to that. Instead, the Modenese decided to just fucking bully them. As the Bolognese, I don't know how it's pronounced, but whatever it is, it sounds fucking delicious, cowered inside their city, they were ruthlessly mobbed by the Modenese, who staged a ye olde athletic event to commemorate those sent out on the expedition and to the eternal shame of Bologna right outside of their walls. So, the Modenese were playing sports and doing Olympic stuff right outside of Bologna's walls to take the piss out of them. They were just having a right jolly old time while all of the Bolognese were all crying. The Bolognese were so thoroughly outrightly defeated that instead of getting the chance to die honourably as the superior army delivered the coup de grace, the Modenese just had an Olympics at them and called it a night. Some sources even say that the Modenese went into the town and stole another bucket, although some sources also say that this was actually the original bucket and that it was merely a spoil of war rather than a MacGuffin. Unfortunately, this is most likely how everything went down, but either way, despite being made up of only one battle that already had a name, the larger conflict became known as the War of the Oaken Bucket. Now, 2,000 people dying over a bucket sounds a bit beyond the pale. But the thing is, if not the bucket, Bologna and Modena would have just fought over something else. And as I mentioned earlier, they probably did. Not to say that they were both not stirring the pot, because, bucket, but the two city-states had already been at each other's throats with mild raids and skirmishes for ages. The bucket was just a convenient flashpoint for tensions to completely boil over, especially since they were both two pawns being egged on by both sides of a much larger ideological war, so that everyone could pile in and just have at it. Despite being called a war, there was never actually another battle. Probably because everyone involved realised how fucking stupid this was. Eventually, an armistice between Bologna and Modena was signed in January of 1326, though the Guelphs and Ghibellines would keep fighting all the way up until 1529, when Italy was invaded by the Spanish and the two sides were forced to unite against a common enemy. There's always a bigger fish. But do you know what wasn't included in the peace terms between Modena and Bologna? The bucket. The Bolognese never got their bucket back. After everything that happened, the Modenese were so chuffed with their prize that they hung it from the Torre della Ghilandia, which is their bell tower in their cathedral. To this day, what is believed to be the actual original bucket still proudly hangs up there, making it less of a bell tower and more of a massive dry well. A replica of the bucket has also been put on display in Modena's town hall. Bologna still bitches about this every so often, but at this point it's just a bit of banter. But apparently, if you're in Bologna, just don't mention the bucket. Just don't talk about it. They are apparently still a bit sore about it. Though, if you're in Modena, oh shit, talk about the bucket. They are so happy about their bucket. Apparently, if you ask someone in Modena about the bucket, they'll be like, "You're here to see the bucket? Yes, come and see our bucket. I'll take you and show you the bucket." They're so fucking psyched about their bucket. But, as the saying goes, to the victor go the spoils. But I think it's for the best that this conflict is properly over. After all, we are all well past the days of religious factions having petty slap fights over their loyalties to the crown and the pope that erupt into outright brawls over a stupid, everyday object. The bucket and bum wars were both single engagements. Though they did cause a lot of deaths, they don't really provide the scope or scale for them to count as full-on wars as we like to imagine them. I feel I've left you a little bit robbed, so I'll close out with a conflict that was more warlike in that it consisted of multiple confrontations, but was still rather goofy in that it was just so fucking Canadian. Despite their mainlands being oceans apart, Denmark and Canada share a maritime border up in the Arctic due to the former's ownership of the self-governing Greenland. In 1973, after a brief dispute, the two countries hashed out exactly where the border ran. However, there was just one problem. An island was left unaccounted for. This is Hans Island. At half a square mile in area, it is so small that it's really just a big rock. And it's extremely cold, battered by wind, and generally completely uninhabitable. And not only are there no people, there's literally nothing there at all. There aren't even any mineral reserves. The island is, in every possible sense, completely useless. And yet, both Canada and Denmark insisted that it was theirs, and they both got pretty defensive about it. You see, Hans Island is slap bang in the middle of the 22-mile wide Nares Strait between Canada's Ellesmere Island and Denmark's Greenland. So the maritime border ran straight through it. And because it's less than 12 miles out from both islands, both Canada and Greenland had a legal claim to it. And even though the island is literally useless and didn't affect maritime rights at all because those were long settled, neither country wanted to give up potential territory. So they ended up arguing over that tiny little red speck on the map there. Because priorities. And no, I'm not talking about the dead pixel. Yes, I'm aware that there is a dead pixel in my camera that randomly appears now and again in all of my videos. I've done everything I can to try and fix it. I've wiped down the lens, I've wiped down the mirror, I've used the little internal cleaning mechanisms, I've done everything to fix it, but it just keeps randomly appearing. I'm probably just going to buy a new camera. In 1984, the conflict over Hans Island escalated into what is now called the Whiskey War, when Canadian troops went to visit the island and left behind a flag plus a note reading "Welcome to Canada" and a bottle of Canadian Club whiskey. The first shot of the war, if you will. Unwilling to take this provocation lying down, the Danish Minister for Greenland then headed over with a delegation and retaliated by knocking down the Canadian flag, planting his own flag and note, and leaving a bottle of either Gammeldansk or schnapps. And then the Canadians returned, knocked down the Danish flag, left their own stuff, and so it went back and forth for the next few decades, leaving the island absolutely covered with wind-shredded flags. The war basically played out like a classic Battlefront 2 game with a lobby full of AI. However, as fun as this was for everyone, the fun in games couldn't last forever. By the mid-2000s, Canada had started doing military exercises and patrols in the area, and climate change melting the ice meant that the island could be used as a staging ground for oil drilling. This meant that the dispute really had to be settled because the useless rock that the two countries had been exchanging drinks on might not be so useless down the line. Canada was also concerned about maintaining their sovereignty over the Northwest Passage because the thawing could actually open up a huge shipping route between Europe and Asia, hence their increased presence. That's also why the conflict was at a stalemate for so long. The Canadians couldn't afford to lose Hans Island because it could then call into question all of their claims to all of the other Arctic islands. And if they lose those, where will they go to club seals? So in 2018, both countries agreed to a joint task force to get the issue sorted once and for all. Both countries considered just sharing the island, but the idea was ultimately rejected. The Whiskey War finally came to an end on the 13th of June 2022, when a treaty settling the whole affair was signed by Denmark's Foreign Minister Jeppe Kofod, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly, and Greenland's Prime Minister Mutby Egede. In the end, after both sides were such good sports about the conflict, it shouldn't come as a surprise that they called it a draw and shared the prize. It was decided that Hans Island would be split roughly down the middle, creating a land border between Canada and Denmark. At the ceremony, the two countries' representatives even marked the occasion by exchanging bottles of booze. In addition to settling a genuine issue over sovereignty and territorial rights, Canada and Denmark decided to settle their dispute to own the Russians. I don't know if you've heard about this, but the Russians are having a little bit of a land dispute of their own at the moment. So the Canadians and Danes decided to resolve their own issue to set a good example. As Kofod put it, it sends a message to the world, including Putin, that when there are things you're disputing over, you have to make the resolution based on international law. Not by the law of force, but by the force of law. Joly also shared the sentiment of the gesture, saying, and I quote, "We are setting a precedent. We are showing to other countries how territorial disputes can be solved. It is possible to settle a disagreement, and it's always the best way to do it through principles and norms that both parties recognise." I'm not going to lie, that's a bit gay and cringe, but of course it's the Canadians awkwardly saying, "Can't we all just get along?" No, Trudeau. We can't. At 3,882 kilometres, Canada and Denmark share the world's longest maritime border. But despite now also sharing a land border, both countries decided to do away with any notions of security on the island, because who the fuck's going to bother to trek there anyway? There's literally nothing there. Plus, the nearest human settlement is 200 miles away. But while all of the important details are hashed out, it's still uncertain whether or not Canada's border with Europe qualifies it for Eurovision. But since countries like Israel and Australia are all taking part, sure, why the fuck not? The Euro part clearly doesn't actually mean anything. But as long as they don't invite the Yanks, then it's hardly ruined. I know that many of you, especially the Yanks in my audience, are probably die-hard patriots desperately waiting for a boogaloo or languishing in the West has fallen camp. But be careful what you wish for. You may have dreams of conquest and bringing honour and riches to your motherland, but when the riches you're spilling blood for are a bucket and a bottle of schnapps on a glorified rock, then war doesn't exactly sound as glorious as you thought. That's not to say that there aren't good reasons to fight for your homeland if the need arises, but it really doesn't have the same glamour to it if some idiot with a big red button on his desk decides that it's go time because of a stolen bucket or because someone in a skirt farted in your general direction.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody should subscribe.